Hi, how's it going?
Hello everyone. Today I'll be doing a comparison between two welders. The first is one of what seems to be the next generation of Yeswelder machines. Yeswelder recently released a bunch of models with similar styling and a new model number convention compared to their older stuff. I will be reviewing the CT2050 soon, but today I've got one of their cheapest new models, the YWA-160. The other welder I have here is PrimeWeld's cheapest machine, a 160ST. I've been wanting to check out a PrimeWeld machine for quite a while. The 160ST probably isn't the PrimeWeld machine most people are interested in, but I'm sure some are, and I had to start somewhere. Both of these machines are small, cheap, 160 amp stick welders with roughly the same features and specs. Both have a lift start TIG mode and a VRD option to reduce open circuit voltage. Both welders are dual voltage and claim the same 120 amps output on 120 volts and 160 amps output on 240 volts. The PrimeWeld 160ST is $200. The YWA-160 is listed at $300 on Yeswelder's website, but I got one on Amazon for about $100. I have no idea if it will remain that price, but that's what it is right now. Both machines use the smaller DINS 25 output connectors. Both have acceptable build quality on the outside for the price, no complaints. As for accessories, the Yeswelder comes with pretty much the same cables that every Yeswelder I've tested does, with stinky, easy melt insulation. The insulation on the PrimeWeld cables feels more durable, and it does hold up to heat a little bit better, but it will still melt. However, the cables for the PrimeWeld are still a step up because they are actual copper cables, rather than the copper-clad aluminum that every Yeswelder I've seen comes with, including the CT2050, by the way. The work clamps are pretty similar. Cheap, but not crazy flimsy, copper-plated steel jaws on both. The electrode holder with the PrimeWeld is nicer with copper alloy jaws rather than the stamped steel jaws, which, again, every Yeswelder comes with. I believe every Yeswelder I've tested at this point failed to provide rated stick welding output. I'm hoping the YWA-160 and CT2050 break this trend. I've already found a couple of questionable specs for the YWA-160 though. Not a big deal, but Yeswelder says the YWA-160 weighs 15 pounds, both on their website and in the manual, but it's noticeably lighter than the PrimeWeld, which is spec'd at 11.9 pounds. So I weighed them. Turns out the Yeswelder weighs a little over 9 pounds, and the PrimeWeld is pretty close to the spec of 11.9. Yeswelder also claims the YWA-160 has a 0.93 power factor, which would be very good, but it sure doesn't seem to have power factor correction, so I'm betting it's closer to 0.7. In fact, PrimeWeld claims 0.73, which is probably much closer. Either way, I'll be testing the power factor of both to find out for sure. Like I said, not a huge deal, but I don't know why Yeswelder continues to struggle with publishing accurate specs for their machines. Speaking of specs and claims, the Yeswelder claims to have hot start and, quote, excellent performance with 6010 rods. The PrimeWeld makes neither of those claims, but we'll soon find out how each of them compare in those regards. I'll also test the TIG lift start characteristics. But before we get to the testing, let's open them up and take a look inside. Looking inside, it's no surprise that the PrimeWeld is heavier. It's slightly more densely packed inside. The first obvious difference is that the PrimeWeld appears to have more heat sinks, but it's a bit deceptive because they form a bit of a tunnel with other components on the inside, so probably 70% or so of the fins are actually quite a bit shorter than they first appear. So the two might have similar total heatsink surface area. The PrimeWeld does enclose all of the hot components in a plastic shroud, so all of the air from the fan is directed over them. Also, while it kind of looks like there's only two capacitors on the PrimeWeld, there's actually two more tucked in underneath the heat sinks. There are a few details that make the PrimeWeld stand out to me a bit over the Yeswelder. It has a large inductor, there's an insulating sheet on the back of the board, the main output leads inside are copper rather than aluminum, and there is a current pickup on the output. The PrimeWeld also has a much better, much more thorough grounding setup than the Yeswelder. There are welded studs on every surface with bolted ground wires on them, including on the outer case. It does seem to have taken a knock in shipping though, because you can see where the board flexed down and contacted the case. Hopefully that doesn't cause any functionality issues. As it is, the board feels very rigid, so it must have been quite a hit. The Yeswelder has a much simpler setup overall. Simpler in and of itself doesn't mean worse, and for the most part, it doesn't seem cheaply done, just a bit simpler. The ground setup, however, does seem poorly done. The only ground wire comes to a little screw that goes through a totally insulated part of the circuit board. The board itself actually grounds through a little tab on the bottom on the opposite corner. This means the ground wire has to transfer its ground through the little screw and through the little tab that's behind the board. If the outer case were to get knocked and bent into direct contact with the unprotected 300-volt DC terminals on the backside of the board, you'd be relying on the screws of the painted case and a little painted tab and a screw going through it to transfer enough current to ground to hopefully trip a breaker and prevent you from getting shocked. Other than the ground setup, the simpler design doesn't mean it's worse, so we'll find out when we start welding if it affects performance. While we're looking at differences that may be purely academic, I thought it might be fun to look at the sine wave of the output on each welder. Both have a similar switching pattern in standard and in reduced open circuit voltage mode, but there is a notable difference. In VRD mode, both clearly use a pulse width modulation of the full output to reduce the effective voltage. What surprised me is the relatively low frequency of this pulse width modulation. The PrimeWeld is around 700 Hz, which already seems a little slow, but the Yeswelder is only 90 Hz, and it doesn't seem to switch as cleanly either. That's slow enough that I can actually see the pulsing on the bar graph of my normal multimeter. It may still be fast enough to be safer in terms of shock than normal mode, but it still seems pretty slow to me. All of that stuff is really interesting to me, but ultimately what matters is how they weld, so let's find out. Starting with the Yeswelder, it does have a hot start function. It lasts less than a half second, and it isn't as aggressive or noticeable in use as it is on some other machines, but looking at the recording on the scope, it's clear that despite the noise in the reading, the current initially is a bit higher and then drops down. And it wasn't a fluke. I did many tests, and when current is set below max, there was a short period of higher output. But 160 amps does seem to be a hard limit on output, so when you are at or near max output, there's no hot start. But otherwise, there is about a quarter to a third of a second of increased amperage when you initially strike an arc. The PrimeWeld didn't claim to have hot start, and it doesn't. I tested multiple times, and there was never a period of increased amperage at the initial start. For what it's worth, it didn't really seem any harder to strike an arc with. So this is the PrimeWeld, 85 amps, and you can see a little bit of a wiggle as it first starts, but really no hot start. Despite the noise, on the Yeswelder, it was pretty clear there was a brief period of higher current. On this welder, there is not. Unfortunately, as suspected, the Yeswelder has nowhere near a 0.93 power factor. In fact, both welders were around 0.5 to 0.6 most of the time. On 240 volts, both welders put out the rated 160 amps and will run a 5/32 7018. Both also have relatively accurate amperage settings, though the Yeswelder is definitely the better of the two here, having nearly dead-on output as compared to the setting. The Yeswelder is also evidently measuring the amperage in real time and showing it on the display while welding, and it's pretty accurate. As I said before, simpler design doesn't necessarily mean worse, and the Yeswelder is the clear winner here. On 120 volts, both again put out the claimed 120 amps, though the PrimeWeld jumps around a bit and averages a bit less than 120 amps, while the Yeswelder bounces around a bit and averages slightly over 120. This means that the PrimeWeld also draws a handful fewer amps when maxed out. The Yeswelder draws just over 40 amps when running on a 120 volt circuit maxed out. The PrimeWeld draws just under 40. Either way, both will definitely trip a 20 amp breaker if you run them maxed out for very long. But both can run a 1/8 inch 7018 from a 120 volt 20 amp breaker, at least for short welds. Neither machine runs a 6010 very well, but the Yeswelder does a bit better. The Yeswelder struggles to get a 6010 going, and the arc has a tendency to go out and stutter a little. But the PrimeWeld just will not run a 6010 at all. Some welders will run 6011 even if they won't run 6010, but unfortunately both of these welders perform virtually the same with 6011 as they do with 6010. I wouldn't plan to run 6010 or 6011 with either of these welders, unfortunately. The arc on the PrimeWeld is much smoother. Maybe this is one area where the simpler design hurts the Yeswelder a bit, but I actually double-checked polarity on the Yeswelder after running my first couple beads because the arc seemed harsh. After a while, I kind of got used to it, but then when I switched to the PrimeWeld, the smoother arc immediately stood out to me. As for TIG, both of these welders have an okay lift start. The Yeswelder has a fairly high start current at 78 amps, but unlike Yeswelder's MP200, it doesn't arc like crazy, the tungsten doesn't stick, and the tungsten stays clean and pin sharp even after multiple starts. It's not a super refined lift start, but it's perfectly usable and I have no complaints with it, especially for a $100 welder. Heck, I wish the $1,000 MP200 had a lift start half this good. Like stick mode though, the TIG arc is loud and harsh. The arc creates a surprisingly loud hissing sound that took me off guard the first time I started a TIG arc. Even when doing scratch start with a $60 stick welder the size of a double cheeseburger, a TIG arc is normally very quiet and smooth with only small variations from machine to machine. I don't know how they managed to make this one hiss like a leaky air hose, but they did. On the plus side, again, the current control is extremely precise. Set at 60 amps, my meter shows a consistent reading within a couple tenths of an amp or less of 60 amps, a couple times actually showing 60.0, so very good. The PrimeWeld has a slightly more gentle TIG start at around 40 to 50 amps, and it has a far quieter, smoother arc, much more like what I'm used to for a TIG arc. However, you can see from my amp clamp that despite being set at the same 60 amps the Yeswelder was, I'm getting about 54 amps out. Certainly not the worst discrepancy I've seen, but it's not perfect. I did have a few quality issues with the Yeswelder. First, the DINS connectors seem to be slightly too far recessed, combined with the rubber boots on the cables being a bit soft, and it's tough to get the cables tightened all the way. The electrode holder cable in particular, because the boot spins so easily on the copper conductor, when you try to push the cable in and turn it, the boot just slides and slips around on the connector. I have to pull the rubber boot back off the connector, tighten the connector itself, and then slide the boot back up, so you kind of almost have to do that with the welder off so it's not live. It's a small issue, but I mention it because it was a minor annoyance every time I had to connect or disconnect the cables. The cooling fan may be a bigger issue. I think a bushing might be out of spec or something because when I first turn the welder on, the fan will come up to speed and then it starts chattering like a motor with a worn out bushing and the fan noticeably slows down. If I tap the back of the welder a couple times, the fan will smooth out and speed back up, but then it'll start chattering and slow down again. After a few tries, it'll stay at full speed and then seem to run okay. It's only done this a few times, but when it does, it takes several tries before it stays smooth. It may go years without getting worse, but I also wouldn't be too surprised if the fan dies sooner than it should. I also had a glitch with the output once. Unfortunately, I wasn't recording at the time. I went to start a 3/32 7018 at 85 amps, and it just would not run, despite having run fine a couple minutes earlier. The arc would start, and then it would pop and go right back out. When I finally managed to get a rod going, the arc would fluctuate and stutter horribly before simply going out again or sticking the rod. I tried a fresh rod on a clean piece of steel, and it was exactly the same. And the welder wasn't overheating or anything. At that point, I just turned the welder off and decided to look into it later because I was out of time for the day anyway. I came back out the next day expecting to do more troubleshooting. I turned the welder on, and after tapping the back of the welder a few times to get the fan running smooth, I grabbed a 3/32 7018 and it ran fine. I didn't do or change anything. I checked the settings and they were exactly as I left them the day before. So I guess it was just a glitch and it never happened again during my testing. Ultimately, for the $100 the YWA-160 currently costs on Amazon, I'd say it's a good value assuming the quality issues I had with mine aren't widespread. Even with those issues aside, it isn't perfect, and Yeswelder still has work to do in terms of publishing accurate specs for their machines, but the YWA-160 is at least a good step forward in that regard. For $100, you get very good amperage accuracy and a usable lift start mode, even if the arc does hiss a bit. On the other hand, for the $300 price they currently list on their website, I'd say you'd be better off to save up a bit and get something nicer. For instance, the ESOP Rogue 130 has far better accessories, is built better, has a better warranty, has good performance on 6010, and it has power factor correction. I haven't tested one, but the WeldCoat Striker 140 is just $350 on Amazon and has power factor correction. So I'd say that the YWA-160 is a viable option at $100, but for $300, I'd probably look around before making a decision. For $200, the PrimeWeld has slightly better build quality, a smoother arc, nicer included cables, lower amperage lift start, and a far quieter fan even when the Yeswelder's fan is working correctly. The output amperage isn't as accurate to the settings as it is on the Yeswelder, and it's definitely worse at 6010 and 6011, but the Yeswelder doesn't really run those well anyway. So overall, I think the PrimeWeld is a nicer machine, but what do you think? Which one would you choose? Hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know. As always, thanks for watching. Take care.